We're back for your ears only. I'm Melissa Exelberth.
And I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. If we know anything about Prime Minister Maliki, it's that he doesn't retreat easily. That was analyst Ahmed Ali at the Institute for the Study of War on the surprisingly peaceful election in Iraq last week, but doubts about the plans of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki if he does not win a sufficient plurality to form a new ruling coalition. Now this.
We are going to defend ourselves against the threat that Russia is continuing their efforts and their aggressive politics. We definitely need more means to defend Ukraine.
Pro-Russian protests in eastern Ukraine on May Day last week. Bravado and a call for help from the Kiev government's deputy foreign minister Danyo Lubkivsky on CNN as the war of words over Ukraine took a far more violent turn. Helicopters were shot down, buildings burned, and scores of deaths suffered by both government forces and pro-Russian separatists inspired and backed by Moscow, despite the threat of escalating U.S. and EU economic sanctions. On the other hand, Russian President Vladimir Putin authorized an envoy to the eastern Ukrainian town of Sloviansk, after which separatists released 7 international military observers and 5 Ukrainian officers held hostage with them. And despite all the bloodshed, 40,000 Russian troops remained restrained on their side of the border.
So what to make of Putin's larger plans, real power, and susceptibility to persuasion? To consider those questions for your ears only, we're joined again by Dr. Nina Khrushcheva, great-granddaughter of former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. She's now a professor of international affairs at the New School University in New York and author of a new family history that's also a study of Kremlin leadership over centuries. It's The Lost Khrushchev, a journey into the Gulag of the Russian mind, new this month from Tate Publishing. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much.
First, explain how Premier Khrushchev was both your grandfather and great-grandfather, and how well you got to know him as a girl.
Khrushchev, everybody knows the First Lady, the Soviet First Lady Nina, who was his second wife. And before that, very few people know that he had another wife who died, unfortunately, in 1919. And from that marriage, he had 2 children. One of them was Leonid, Khrushchev's son, and my mother, Julia, is his daughter. When Leonid died in 1943, my mother was adopted as Nikita Khrushchev's daughter, although by birth she was his granddaughter. So I am by relations a granddaughter, and by birth I am a great-granddaughter. I knew him well enough as a grandfather. I mean, he died when I was just a little girl, but we did spend all our weekends with him, so I really learned a lot about his personality as a grandfather.
In a nutshell, what did you learn from him and the research on your book about what drives and deters Kremlin leaders from the Tsars to Stalin to Putin? It's as much about fiction as fact you've written.
It is. Russia is a very big country. And in order to, it used to be 11 time zones. Now it's sort of artificially shrunk down to 9, but it takes a large territory from Germany to Japan, and that actually requires a certain amount of fiction because you have to imagine this land. You cannot really travel it that easily, or couldn't, at least at the time. So for all Russian leaders, Soviet leaders, it's all about this land's greatness, is how it measures itself against the world. And size does matter. And as Khrushchev tried to be different, he still was all about Soviet superiority over everything else.
You were also the last research assistant for the late, great U.S. diplomat George Kennan, father of Washington's successful Cold War policy of containment. I wonder, bringing that and your Russian background all together, to bear on the Ukraine crisis, how vulnerable do you think Putin is to pressure from Russia's privileged class or common people if sanctions and market forces really do increase economic hardship?
I think he will be very, very vulnerable. So far, it's just his very, very inner circle, and I'm sure they were somewhat prepared to what was coming to them. I think if blanket sanctions go against all Russians, I think Putin is tremendously vulnerable because he created a middle class. He used the high oil prices around the world to sort of enrich Russia in personal terms. And I think his people are going to be very upset if all this availability would be taken away from them.
Would lethal weapons from Washington help the Kiev government put down pro-Russian separatists or just trigger more armament from over the border, if not Russian troops?
I think it triggers more unrest, and we've seen that the minute sort of Vice President Joe Biden went to Kiev and encouraged Kiev to fight, Kiev decided to fight, and then suddenly, or not so suddenly, violence increased and more people died.
Putin says the current Kiev military action against the separatists ends his ability to control them. But what did you make of Moscow's envoy facilitating the release of those international observers and even Ukrainian officers?
I think just for me, it's a show that Europeans can talk to Putin and Americans can't. Because we've seen a very important press conference with Angela Merkel and Barack Obama together, I think yesterday, and there was very different language. There's very different stance about this. Germany was not lecturing Russia, and I think Angela Merkel, when she talks to Putin, she's more successful in achieving those goals. It was very important, and I do think the United States, and as George Kennan always said, America doesn't need to have this, self-righteous rhetoric because it really doesn't help matters in any way. But I think it's also Putin's, he showed his hand, which I thought was a really good sign. So he showed that he can actually influence the insurgency.
You predicted re-annexation of Crimea, which your grandfather actually gave away, but you doubt Putin really wants to take on the political and economic problems of eastern Ukraine. If not, why not? And what is his ultimate goal in the region?
The ultimate goal is not to let Ukraine go west. And I think Putin just doesn't want, he wants it as a buffer between east and west. He doesn't want it as a Western country. I don't think he wants to really invade Ukraine because your question about sanctions earlier was well taken. Then it would be an entirely different ball game around the world if he does go forcefully and bluntly into Ukraine. However, destabilization, making sure that the Kiev elections on May 25th would go in his favor, that is, Ukraine would perhaps agree that it's going to be federation, which he wants, with more importance or more influence of the eastern regions that are pro-Russian, supposedly. Then, of course, not signing any NATO agreements, any EU agreements and whatnot.
Nina Khrushcheva is the great-granddaughter of former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, now a professor of international affairs at the New School University in New York. Her new book is both a family history and a study of Kremlin leadership over the years. It's The Lost Khrushchev, A Journey into the Gulag of the Russian Mind from Tate Publishing.
Quote from the news, "Dude, this was like 2 years ago." That was former National Security Council spokesman Tommy Victor on Fox News, dismissing questions about political editing of talking points on the terrorist attack in Benghazi 2 years ago. New hearings on it in the House have been ordered.
Next, the High Court meets high tech for your ears only.